So when was it? It would have been about 2004. I'd worked in a games company where we'd been working on a Warhammer project and been working on it for quite a few years and built up a relationship with some of the people on licensing side and people within Games Workshop. We'd always go in for meetings with John Blanche, he'd show us sketches and all that sort of stuff. And then Dave Gallagher worked with us quite extensively, a couple of days a week for the whole project. So I kind of built up a relationship with those because I was on the art side, character art. So we built up a relationship on that sort of side of things. And then there came a point where the project was cancelled, I think it was. I can't remember the ins and outs. But from there, I'd been made redundant, so I had a bit of time on my hands. Had some redundancy payouts that kept me going. I'd always wanted to be an illustrator. It's one of the things I trained for when I was at college and university. That I just wanted. I'd always been drawing Space Marines, so I just, in my spare time, just drew a couple of Space Marines using the skill set that I'd learned making games. So it was very 3D heavy, a lot of Photoshop. And from one of my contacts from the Warhammer project, I got in touch with Christian Dunn and just sent him, it was on spec, I just sent him a picture of a Space Marine and said, would this be good enough for a cover? And he replied relatively quickly. I was expecting nothing. He replied and said, we like it, but could you maybe resolve some of the features, the face or the heraldry on the armour, just to make it more tie-in with what they wanted. I was like, fine, got nothing else to do.
Yeah, sure.
Did that, and then, they bought it off me, which was great. I thought, this is cool. Imagine getting paid to draw Space Marines. And then he came back to me and said, listen, we know you've done computer games, you're good at Space Marines. Have you heard of a game called Dawn of War? It's like, well, yeah, I know that. I played it a lot. One of my favourite games. And so they were doing a few tie-in novels, and they said, could you do a Blood Raven, Sister of Battle? And because I'd worked in video games and they knew how CG, as it were, works, they knew copy and pasting was relatively easy. So they were thinking big battle scene. They wanted a big scene of Eldar, I think it was. I said, could you just copy and paste hundreds of Eldar in the background? I'm like, yeah, easy. So I kind of did that. I mean, yeah, technically it's not just copy and pasting. You have to make each one look different.
A bit more to it than that.
Exactly. It's a bit more refined and resolved. But the principle was just big battle scenes. And I delivered that and they liked that. And then I think it was not long after, a couple of months later, Christian said, we've got this project. I think he'd been cooking it up with Mark Gascoigne at the time. We've got this project we think you'd be a perfect fit for. We've got maybe other artists that would work on it as well, but we know you do big battle scenes and you know the material quite well. Have you heard of something called the Horus Heresy? And I nearly spat out my tea. It's like, of course I know the Horus Heresy. I've got the compendiums. I've got my original Rogue Trader rulebook, and I know it. I wouldn't say inside out, but I definitely know the big beats, and I was a big fan of the artwork and the models and all that sort of stuff. So I literally have never jumped at a chance like I did then. And I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, I was playing it cool.
Inside you were?
Inside I'm freaking out like a fanboy, as I still am. So I kind of just was like, yes, let's do this. And it just kind of took off from there. They sent me a brief. I don't think the manuscript had been finished. I certainly didn't read it, but they had a couple of beats that they wanted to hit. It was like Space Marines, big battle scene, attacking a fortress. And that was about it. But again, because I was like a fan of the material originally, I was always obsessed with artists back in the day. One of the reasons I got into the hobby was because I was on the artwork side of things. I collected the miniatures, and I've still got a lot of my original old metal Terminator kits and Harlequins and stuff like that. So I've been collecting and painting and buying the books, White Dwarf, all the materials, for as long as I could remember. And I'd always really loved Kev Walker's epic battle scenes. I mean, I loved his work, full stop. But I always remember just like spending hours, especially on those double page images in, say, White Dwarf, where there would be literally a sea of Space Marines, and there'd be like little pockets of action, and there would be like a big thing happening. So in my head I was thinking, I think I'd like to do something like that. So it was just a case of just taking all the stuff I'd ever wanted to do and starting to apply it to the covers. And then I submitted the first cover for Horus Rising, and they liked that. Although I think at the time, I think it was designed to be the second cover. I can't remember the reasons why they switched it around, but I think it was Phil Sibbering's cover was designed to be the first, which is why the armour is white. And mine, which was for the second cover, they'd already started scratching off the Lunar Wolves markings and applying Eye of Horus. And the armour's that kind of, turning to that mint green, sort of olive drab type thing. As it was then. I know they've rationalised the colour schemes a bit more, but this was the Wild West of like making stuff. It was,
back then it was a bit more loose.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I always go back to the rule of cool. It's like if it looks cool, let's go for it, see if it works. So my cover was designed to be the second, but they flipped it round, used it for the first one, and then I think they released it. It was successful. They released a second one. They were both very successful, and then they came back to me and said, listen, it was supposed to be, or they'd originally positioned it as a different artist for each cover, but they liked the work I'd done so much and how I'd sort of delivered it, that they were like, do you want to do a few more? And that was about it. A few more turns into 20 years of work or something like that. And it's been great. But yeah, I mean, looking back on it, it feels kind of very random and ad hoc. There was no grand plan. But it just kind of worked, and so it felt like everybody just kept going down that path. It's like, well, this is working, let's just keep doing it. And people like it, and people still like it. That's one of the great things about it. It's been one of my greatest achievements of my sort of working life, has been working on that, and all for the sake of being made redundant at a job and then just doing something.
Funny how things turn out, isn't it?
Yeah, so yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, looking at the Horus Rising cover then, I suppose, did you already, I mean, you've already mentioned like the Kev Walker epic. The one thing that always stands out to me is the two blokes without helmets on, and they're kind of like iconic faces now almost. Was there any like inspiration behind those? Are they just feral looking characters like from, or anything like that?
Yeah, so those two characters on Horus Rising, they were... My original intention, and from discussions with Mark and Christian at the time, was this hasn't been seen before. We haven't done this, or they hadn't done this era before in such detail. I mean, I know there'd been like the Epic Games and all that sort of stuff, but they were like 6mm figures. Yeah. So I was kind of trying to draw upon, extrapolating that out, pulling out and say, well, let's make these bigger. Let's do stuff we haven't seen before. 40k Marines tend to have quite martial haircuts on the whole. I know there are differences within different chapters. But I think, yes, you said feral, and I wanted something that looked quite base and basic and almost human, because I feel like in those earlier books, the way it was positioned, the way it was talked about, was this was like an era of men.
Yeah, sure.
People. And there was no chaos, there was no mad, there's nothing like that. So it was literally just people. And also I'd been watching a lot of Lord of the Rings at the time. So stylistically, in terms of colour and tone, I was thinking of that little prequel bit at the beginning where they're fighting Sauron, where everything's desaturated. Funnily enough, everybody's got long hair on that, so maybe that's where that comes from. But I was in my head, I saw the Horus Heresy as this pre-film segment to 40k. That was the kind of the overall thinking. So the fact they've got long hair was because it had never really been done before, and it was a chance just to put something different out there, kind of make my mark. Just try and make the faces look believable. One of the things I've always tried to do in my covers, and one of the intentions, was to make things feel believable, not necessarily real, but within the context of everything else in that image, you feel like it's the best scene from a movie that hasn't been made yet. In that everything looks the coolest, everything is lit really well, everything just everything's just been considered. You know, whether it's the positions, in the same way actors, you know, good actors seem to make these decisions that feel right. I just wanted to try and achieve that in making it feel like a film still. Like I say, from something like Lord of the Rings. I think when we started this, I think the films had either just come out or had been out for a while. So I was very much in that mindset. It's like, let's make this, filmic, cinematic, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
And also because we were using a wraparound format, that kind of lent itself, certainly when I was working on it, to feeling like it was not 16:9, but
that aspect ratio.
Yeah, the aspect ratio was kind of epic and cinematic. Obviously, within that framing, you have to allow for title boxes and stuff like that. But you know, you still put stuff there. So again, that was part of it, was to make it feel as much like a film. It's kind of welcoming. It's like, hey, the book you're going to read is going to be epic. It's going to be cinematic. It's going to be high drama. It's going to be high octane. It's going to be cool. It's going to be exciting, and it's going to be humane. So I've always been considerate of at least adding some element of humanity to my pictures, because for me personally, drawing people is the hardest thing, but it's also what can convey emotion most directly. People read people's faces, or the way people stand or their pose. And a lot of that comes from working in comics and doing some work there. You have to really be able to quickly get a gesture across. So that's something I learned working in that field, trying to bring it to bear in the book series. So I've just been, like I say, it became like a melting pot of all the things. Because I didn't know how long this series was going to last. Originally it was going to be 3 books, and then it was going to be like a 9-book series. And so every time I was thinking, I'm just going to throw everything in.
Yeah, if this is your one shot, so I'll go all in.
Exactly, shoot your shot, just go for it, throw the kitchen sink in there. So I was literally just going for broke each time. Admittedly, when I look back, I'm thinking, how on earth did I maintain that? And some covers hit the mark more than others, but I always tried on each one to make them look as cool as I could. So yeah, that was the intention. Like I say, when I look back at them, I'm like, if I knew, I would probably be like, I need a bit of a breather, but it was such a roller coaster in a positive way. It was just fun from start to finish. That, hopefully that was evident in each cover. I mean, some people have their favourites, and if they preferred one to another, it's like, well, you've got the choice. You know, there's plenty there for people to sort of get into, whether they like it or, you know, they take inspiration from it or however they respond to it. It's been great, but yeah, that was kind of the intention, was just to try and get an element of humanity, because usually it's like faces, you know, behind masks, visors and stuff like that. But like I say, the Kev Walker stuff always had little, like, you know, helmetless characters, or even like the earlier stuff, Pete Nifton or a lot of those earlier artists, they would just have the coolest and most expressive faces. Even like Karl Kopinski, it's like, those guys were just so great at faces. I think, apart from them being great artists, I think they rendered the people so well that's what kind of hooked everybody into their artwork. And
like you say, it's believable. You know, you can really kind of identify with these people. You know, even
exactly. Because like I say, that's the hook. That's the hook, and I was always trying to look for that in amongst all the grand, you know, space opera stuff. It's like, what are the people doing? How do they look? What do they feel like? Make the reader think, what would it be like if I was there? Surrounded by either space marines or in the, you know, the void, or in the middle of the warp, stuff like that. So, yeah. And again, that's kind of circles back to my kind of fanboy wish list of like, wouldn't it be cool if? What would it be like if I was there? So, yeah, I kind of come at it from those angles.
Yeah, sure. You recently redid then False Gods, I believe, wasn't it? Do you want to talk about that? Obviously, you know, was it Philip Sibering? He did the original one, and then you got, I imagine, asked by Black Library. Was it for that book there next to you? Or?
I believe, I can't remember what it was for, but it's definitely in that book. I didn't know if they were going to repackage it or whatever, but personally it was great for me just to kind of scratch that itch.
Sure.
It's like, I've done all these books, but there's one cover, a brilliant cover as it was, but there's one cover that wasn't mine. So I think on a personal level, it was just great to kind of go back and, sort of tick that box and say, right, I can say I've done a cover for each of the Heresy books. So that was the thinking there. And if anything, I took inspiration from what Phil did. It's like, again, a big sea of characters, people in different positions and doing different things, but just through the filter of how I would approach it. It's how I would approach it now, so it's slightly different to how I started.
Yeah, compared to 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of my favourite artists have developed over time, and I see that as a natural progression. It's, everything's connected. So, yeah, where I am now to where I was then, and seeing how, other artists have sort of developed over time, I always took inspiration from that. So, yeah, so that was like, going back to an old cover but with new sensibilities, but just again trying to think back to like, well, what was it that made those covers sort of important and iconic of their time. So yeah, I mean, things like coloration is, as the series moved on, things got more lurid and chaotic, quite literally,
there's a lot more hues, like purples and crazy.
Yeah, so you're able to sort of play with things and push the boundaries a bit more. So yes, sort of going back and thinking, well, let's just dial down a lot of that imagery and saturation and try and get back to, again, like an age of reason, it felt like. So things weren't so crazy because everything was far more muted and sort of level. So, but then there's a part of me that still wants to put like mad colours in.
Of course, the big change you did was change the armour. Phil's original, they are, like you said, they're in white, and you did them in the green of
yes
Horus.
Yes, I did. I think that was because technically that cover is for the second book.
Sure.
I don't know, I wouldn't like to say that's canon, but in terms of release order, I think that cover is so identified with the second book, they were like, just make them full Sons of Horus.
Sure.
For that cover. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why that colour is like, like I say, it was like an interpretation or a response, or just trying to, make it fit into the narrative of the book release, not necessarily how the art works, the order that they were produced in. So yeah, that's why I mean, I get asked that question a lot. It's like, why is this that colour and that colour? So yeah, hopefully that explains it for a few more people until I get asked another time.
Yeah, sure. And then moving on to the third book then, Galaxy in Flames, is very much a continuation of the theme, I suppose. You have these, really identifiable characters right front in your face. You got all the epic scale going on in the background. Was that, for you, I suppose, was that just, it worked last time, so I'll do the same again kind of thing, or?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so that third, like I say, the original intention was this was going to be a trilogy. And so that was the thinking. Obviously, by the time we got to the third book, I think, the team were thinking, maybe we could eke this out a bit longer. But mentally, I was like, well, let's just take a lot of the sensibilities. Like I say, back then I was working with some 3D elements. So some of those assets and just dragging them forward and saying, well, let's just have a play around and see what we can get. So yeah, there is a continuation. It's kind of on purpose in that was the thread that kind of, when the books landed, I think having that continuity certainly helped visually what they look like on the shelves. People are like, oh, okay, I see. Space Marines, long hair, explosions, stuff like that. It gives it a look, and with the type and the text. I mean, a lot of credit goes to, Black Library and how they presented it and, the choices they made. That black and gold and foil printing, I think it was, just made it look like nothing, certainly no Warhammer book I'd seen up to that day. Yeah, so the designer's treatment of the book covers, I think, elevated the artwork itself. So I produced artwork to as good a quality as I could. And when I sent it off, to the client, to Black Library, when they made it an actual item with the text and stuff like that, it just looked so much more official. In my head, I'm just like this guy drawing in my sort of spare room. But then when it becomes a thing with all the text and stuff like that, it looked totally different. So, so there was that. But in terms of Galaxy in Flames, I think, yes, I wanted to kind of move things forward so you could start to see explosions are bigger. And I was also conscious as a fanboy that I always wanted to see a Titan on the cover, especially a void shield around it. I was like, in my head, I'd played so many games when I was a kid of Adeptus Titanicus that my head was filled with things like, what would it look like? What would it sound like? What would again, if it was a film, how would it play out? So I was literally, again, ticking that wish list of like, okay, let's put a Titan in there. Let's have a void shield. Let's have things hitting the void shield and explosions dissipating around it. I was just literally, again, just going for broke, throwing it in there. And I think the Titan's really far back in the corner. Yeah. So you might see that in a couple of those earlier books, like those sort of details that maybe now would be front and center. I wasn't sure about, and I don't think the team were very sure about depicting. So they were like, let's put it in the background. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it's just a background detail, which I was cool with because it meant you could focus on the foreground. So with that, yeah, there was those sorts of elements in the background. I was trying to get a bit more up close and personal with the Marines, and also getting them a bit more physical, interacting more. So the first picture I did was them en masse assaulting a fortress. So it's literally just like marching towards. Force, yeah. From, I don't know, is it left to right? Yeah, just walking that way. But this one I was like, well, let's have them fighting. And, I thought, I've always loved, bolters being fired in pictures. It's just so cool. I really love it. Again, fanboy. But then I was like, I love the thought that because this is like people, this is like an age of reason, sometimes I just get up close to the person and start punching. Literally, melee combat, stripping away any weaponry. So I was really conscious that I wanted to show, again, something that hadn't really been seen that much before. So kind of Marine on Marine, fighting, punching, stripping back any kind of artifice of like weaponry and just having it man on man. So yeah, again, I was just putting it in there. There was I don't think there was anything in the brief that dictated that. The briefs usually were quite broad. These characters or these, chapters on this planet, in this kind of environment, with this in the background, and they're doing this, they're fighting. It might just be that. So
there's so many variables there that you can...
Exactly. A lot of the time when you're an illustrator or you're looking at things from different angles. Like, can I do this? Has this been done before? What's a cool way of doing this? What's a different way of doing this? So a lot of the time it was just, how can I make this look as good as possible? Luckily, by the time we got to that book, I thought there might be a few more books. So I was thinking, well, if I don't do that in this cover, am I doing another one? Usually I'd submit, say, 4 or 5, maybe 4 thumbnails, options of what we could do. And they would choose, Black Library would choose their preferred one, and we take that forward. But sometimes the thumbnails I didn't use, they might make it into future covers anyway. So sometimes what you think is a good idea is almost too good to waste. So it'll be there somewhere that you can draw upon later and then use in another sort of piece of work or something like that. So that was kind of the intention, was just to kind of keep showing stuff that we hadn't seen before, keep doing stuff that was like new and exciting, that people would be like, okay, this is different, this is cool, this is interesting. But the trick with the book cover is always to kind of serve the content. Again, a lot of the times the brief is based on the manuscript that's been written so far. So you're conscious that your work isn't just a piece in itself. I remember one of the times when we were working on the Warhammer video game, we would occasionally go in and sort of see the artists in the studio, and I remember sitting down with John Blanche. It was like picking the brains of Rembrandt, because he had so much wisdom and knowledge and interesting insights, some particular to Games Workshop, other ones more broad about illustration as a career, that a lot of that was sort of fed into my head. It's like, if you're an illustrator, it's art with a purpose. Things like that, and other nuggets of wisdom that I kind of held on to, because, you don't get taught this stuff. You have to either seek out the information yourself or just kind of make it up as you go along. So most careers, I think, in illustration, and certainly mine, have been a combination of those two streams.
Yeah. And moving on then to Flight of the Eisenstein, book number 4. It's almost like a variation on a theme, where you kind of, you mentioned about the Titan in the background, and of course on this one you've got a great unclean one in the background, and it's almost got this, in my opinion, the book has a sense of good versus evil at this point in the narrative. You've obviously got Nathaniel Garrow escaping to go tell Rogal Dawn that Horus's treachery is afoot.
Yes. So with Flight of the Eisenstein, I think Yeah, you're right. Things were starting to get a little bit more exotic and chaotic. Like you say, villains were starting to reveal themselves, or at least make themselves known in one way or another, certainly in terms of the narrative. And as far as I remember, I think the brief was quite loose on that, to have a great unclean one in the background. Although I don't know if at the time that bit had been written yet. I don't know. It's all very vague. So again, me being the fanboy I was, I thought, okay, we're starting to see chaos rear its head. And obviously the Realms of Chaos book, the Les Edwards cover with the Nurgle on the front, was like, that's the ultimate depiction.
It's such an iconic piece.
Oh my God, nothing gets better than that in my mind. It's perfect. Even the rendering, I was always a fan of real media. I mean, you can't beat it really. My work is digital, and that's just because it's fast, and I can revise accordingly and quickly. But when I go back and I see a lot of those earlier artworks, certainly, you know, the pen and ink of John, or Les Edwards' sort of oil painting works, and then the Hero Quest cover, stuff like that. It's like nothing comes close to that tangibility and feeling. So I think that was something I'm always conscious of leaning into. With my covers, I could do them in gouache or acrylic, but they would take 5 times as long, and I would have to be going through acrylic paints like nobody's business. So yeah, there's time and money is the two factors there. So yeah, so I was like going back to old artworks and just trying to again lean into the history of Warhammer 40k in the same way the books were almost the history of why 40k is 40k. I was trying to lean into the visual history, thinking, well, okay, a great unclean one looks like that, or the architecture looks a certain way. I'd be going through all my old books and just thinking, you know, I'll take a bit of this, I'll take a bit of that. Like any illustrator working in 40k, it's a playground, one of the best playgrounds you've got, and there's so much stuff you can play with. That bringing it all together in new and different ways, it's one of its strengths, and I think it's why it's got such longevity, is that there's always different ways of approaching the material. So in terms of that cover, I was trying to approach it in a way that a lot of Nurgle had been depicted in, you know, semi-light or shadow, and I thought, well, let's put it in daylight, which it's difficult to make evil things look evil when they're in bright daylight. Yeah. So that was the trick with that cover, is just trying to double down on how can we make it look bad. To be honest, it turns out it's not that difficult because it's a great piece of design anyway. It's big, green, covered in boils, antlers. It's like, okay, well, turns out, yeah, whilst I was drawing, it's like, oh, this is quite easy in some ways. But then I was trying to do like little effects around it, because working digitally, I really liked applying effects, but not making it look too digital. I think the earlier pieces certainly have that look about them, but again, that's because that's where I was 20 years ago. I'd literally been in video games, heavily using Photoshop, not filters, because if you use a Photoshop filter, it looks like you used a Photoshop filter. Sure. The irony being that I spent all my time actually painting. I just happened to be doing it in Photoshop. So it's like a hand and I wouldn't say brush, but it's a stylus. But it's just sitting there and doing the work, doing the legwork, just making it look like it's been made by someone. The sense of craft and skill. So yeah, a lot of time was spent on that great unclean one. And then it was put behind a big black cover. You know, a title and a blurb box. Yeah. But again, that was one of the things, was like, let's just put it in the back. If it works, it works. We know that it works. So we were constantly I felt like we were finding our feet all times. I feel like, you know, we'd been up and running really quickly. I think we knew it was working. So yeah, when I say finding feet, I think we were going at a fair pace, thinking, well, this seems to be working. The books seem to be selling well. They like the artwork I've done. The whole machine was working quite well. And like I say, the fact people were buying it was it's the only indicator really of success, I think, in terms of, you know, having a project last that long. So yeah, that's kind of where that was. Yeah, it was just, again, leaning back into as many things as I used to like, and trying pulling them forward in my direction.